Hello there, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Shonen Flop Gaiden, the companion series to the podcast Shonen Flop that dives further into topics relating to the manga series being covered by the main podcast. As always, I am your host, Tucker Whatley, and this time, the series that was covered by the main podcast was the recently canceled Shonen Jump manga, Phantom Seer, which is about a teenage boy and his older sister and a friend they meet, and he has powers as a shaman, and so does his older sister, and they get into a lot of hijinks involving ghosts and stuff like that. And this general focus on shamanism is not something that is exclusive to this series. It's becoming quite a thing in popular culture recently. When you think about shaman, you might think about people with new agey sorts of interests. You might think of celebrity fads. You might think of people who are really into psychedelics. You might even think about this guy, unfortunately. But many listeners to Shonen Flop and Shonen Flop Gaiden will probably think about the manga series Shaman King, which is getting a second anime adaptation this year. In fact, the first few episodes have already aired. But Shaman King and Phantom Seer aren't alone. There actually seem to be quite a few. Shamans seem to be pretty popular topics for manga, anime, manhwa, and light novels. In fact, there particularly seems to be a lot of Korean stuff centered around shamans. So what exactly is a shaman anyway? The answer to that question is more complicated than you would think. But the word itself is a pretty good place to start. The word shaman was introduced into European languages by a Dutchman called Nicolaas Witsen. I don't speak Dutch, so I hope that's good. Who wrote a book in 1692 detailing his time journeying and staying with the native peoples of Siberia. And he first used the term in talking about the religious beliefs of these indigenous people. So who are these people who are called shamans by themselves and by the societies they live in Central and Northern Eurasia, in modern-day Siberia and Mongolia for the most part? Well, these individuals have several traits that they share among themselves. One trait is that the community around them believes that there is a physical world and there is a transcendent world or a spirit world, and that shamans, the people in their society who are shamans, have the ability to communicate with that other realm directly, which most people don't have the ability to interact with in the same way. And the shamans use this connection as a way of serving certain purposes in the community, most often healing and divining, finding answers to questions, seeing the future, seeing the truth, that sorts of things. And any sort of trouble that has to do with the spirit world is also the shaman's job to deal with. Shamans are also typically a certain type of person, personality-wise. So shamans are known for being more intelligent, sharp, intuitive people. They're sensitive. Sometimes they have very eccentric personalities that differ greatly from the community around them. And sometimes they also have physical defects. So people who might be born with additional toes or fingers tend to become shamans. Or people who have limps or birth defects or something like that. Another trait of shamans is that they not only can communicate and interact with the spirit realm, they are actively aided by the spirits. Usually, people believe that shamans have a number of spirits who aid them, and they might even have a special guardian spirit who takes the form of an animal or could even take the form of a person of the opposite sex, and there might be sexual things that happen between them. I'm not sure about that, how common that is, but that's what the notes say. Another important aspect of these Siberian and Mongolian shamans is that they typically do not choose to become shamans. So it is the spirit world, the supernatural beings who actually make this choice and impose it upon the shamans. And in fact, in lots of stories, it seems that shamans really don't want to be shamans before they become shamans. Well, what happens is that apparently if a shaman resists the call by the spirit world to become a shaman, the spirits will actually torture that person. So a lot of shamans talk about being stricken with disease. Apparently, even sometimes they talk about shamans are struck by lightning, and that is what makes them become a shaman. Apparently, a big symbolic aspect of your transformation into a shaman is the tearing up or cutting up of the shaman's soul by the spirit beings, so that the person the shaman was before they were stricken down dies and they're reborn as their shamanic self. Another important aspect of shamanism is the trance. The shaman interacts and communicates with the spirit world by entering a trance state at will. And apparently it is believed that this is similar to what you would call like astral projection or something like that. So while in the trance state where the shaman doesn't have control over their own body, their soul leaves their body and then communicates with the spirit world. While this is happening, their body can do stuff like have spirits speak through them sometimes and stuff like that. Apparently, shamanic battles are also a thing. Shamans are sometimes compelled to fight each other. From what I read, it usually doesn't have a specific rhyme or reason. Like, shamans will just fight each other using spirit stuff, I guess. Apparently, like, their spirits will take the form of animals or something and do battle with each other, and the one who is the victor has good fortune after that, and the one who loses is maybe not killed physically, but they're as good as dead. But yeah, apparently it doesn't really have a discernible rhyme or reason. It's just shamans sometimes have to do spirit battles with each other. It's weird. Also, shamans are well renowned for the symbols of their office. The most famous is the shaman's drum, which they often will continuously strike while entering a trance or in a trance or when trying to communicate with spirits. But they often have certain types of ceremonial headgear and garb. They have these like little rattly things that they use. And sometimes they have other sorts of instruments and little doodads. So these are the traits of a classical shaman of Central Asia. But these days, when you hear people use the term shaman, a lot of the times what they're talking about is not that. So why and how was the term stretched to mean more things? Well, it started with, as a lot of things do, with European colonialism. So the European colonists, conquerors, whatever, whenever they came into the Americas, North America, Central America, South America, they encountered indigenous peoples whose culture was very different from their own, and people with religious beliefs that were very different from their own. And these Native American people, a lot of their tribes in these different peoples had people in their societies who were spiritual leaders and had some things in common with the spiritual leaders of the societies of Central and Northern Eurasia. And there were some similarities between the belief systems of these peoples and the belief systems of the peoples of Central Eurasia, especially coming at it from a European Christian of the 15 and 1600s point of view. So when talking about these societies, the Europeans searched for a word to describe some of these spiritual practices, and specifically these spiritual leaders and healers and stuff like that who worked within Native American societies. And the main point of reference that Europe had up until this point, until the early colonial era, was the early contacts between Europeans and the people of Central Eurasia that I talked about previously. And so the term shaman was applied to these other people to describe their practices and specifically this vocation that existed within these indigenous societies. Now, are these spiritual leaders in Native American cultures actually shamans? Well, it might be tempting to say that yes, that this is some sort of universal thing that exists among cultures of a certain population and technology level and yada yada yada. But if you ask someone who exists in these cultures, there's a good chance that their answer might be no. No way. In fact, I found a website called tengarism.org. I think it's broken now. I was able to find it through the Wayback Machine. This is actually a website created by someone who is Buryat, which is one of the groups of people in Central and Northern Eurasia. This is a website authored by this individual, which seeks to explain a lot of these concepts to a English-speaking audience. And there is specifically a page about the use of the term shaman to describe Native American practices that the Buryat author is very adamant in protesting. Quote, "When the Russians started conquering and colonizing Siberia, they first came upon shamans among the Evenk people. The Evenks and their neighbors, the Buryats, used the term shaman for their spiritual leaders. The word spread from the Russians to the Americas via anthropologists who were studying Native Americans. These anthropologists needed a word to describe what they thought the Native Americans were doing and did not understand the very different worldviews that the peoples had. It is a shame that Native peoples were not given a chance to define their own spiritual beliefs and had outsiders label them in generic, condescending, and destructive ways. They never bothered to ask the Native Americans what their words for their beliefs were. I myself am Buryat, and find it confusing how the term has grown and changed in the West. What was once a very specific term used by my people has become to mean everything and yet nothing in the West. Westerners tend to label everything earth-based as shamanism because their culture lacked the vocabulary to discuss these matters otherwise." End quote. As European colonialism started to spread, so did the use of the term shaman. Europeans started applying the term to the peoples they encountered in Australia and Africa and even parts of Asia. Over time, the definition just kept getting stretched further and further and further until it started to be applied to spiritual leaders that have some sort of connection to animistic or earth-based belief systems or faith healers in indigenous-like religions in general, or to people just into doing psychedelics and talking about spirits and stuff. Like the Buryat writer said, it came to mean everything and nothing. So, is there any sort of context for the use of shamanism or faux shamanism in manga series like Seer, besides the just general watered down cultural appropriation that is generally associated with the term shaman these days by most people not from Central and Northern Eurasia. Well, Japan actually does have a little bit of a shaman-esque culture. I don't know if you've ever seen any sort of reference to shrine maidens within Japanese pop culture. They are called miko, and they are young girls whose job it is to work at shrines, maintain them, but they also have some ceremonial roles. And some historians believe that this tradition of Mikoism probably descended from an older, much more shaman-like tradition. But the shrine maiden job is pretty much what still survives today. There are other sorts of spirit specialists in Japan called fusha, which are kind of like mediums, and they perform some shaman-like duties, like performing certain rituals and divination. But they don't really seem totally connected to the old shamanic traditions. However, probably a stronger influence on the inclusion of shaman-like practices in Japanese pop culture, like manga, would be the practices of the Ainu people. For those unfamiliar with it, the ethnic Japanese are not the only or first people to inhabit the Japanese islands. Before the ethnic Japanese, there was, and still is, the Ainu, who are the native peoples of Japan, the indigenous peoples, who came to the island chain about 10,000 years ago. And today's ethnic Japanese came later and largely displaced a good portion of the Ainu people. But there are still Ainu communities today, mostly on the northernmost island of Hokkaido. And these indigenous peoples, the Ainu, they have a tradition of spiritual specialists in their society that has many similarities to the Siberian shaman. In Ainu, they are called the Tuskur, and these individuals use rituals in order to become possessed by spirits called kamui, and they perform a lot of the same sorts of roles in society as the shamans do in Siberia and Mongolia. It's also probably no convenience that I found more manhwa and other Korean sources of shamans used in pop culture, because Korea seems to have a much stronger connection to shaman-like or even just straight-up shamanism practices than Japan does. So Korea has a tradition of mu, which is their general word for shaman-like practitioners, and they have a tradition that dates back to prehistoric times, and they predate a lot of these foreign imported belief systems such as Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and much later on Protestant Christianity. Like shamanism, in this tradition there is a emphasis on the worship of nature spirits, but also of gods and ancestors. While mu is the general word for this practice, there are separate terms for male practitioners and female practitioners. There are the mudang, who are female, and in latter times, the last few centuries, these have been more prevalent than their male counterparts, who are called baksu. And one of the most important roles for both mudang and baksu are the performance of a ritual called a gut, in which the mudang or baksu requests good fortune from the spirits, as well as just a general good relationship between the human world and the spirit world. And there is speculation and some credence among historians that this actually might be true shamanism, that this practice might have been deeply influenced by Siberian shamanism. And in fact, the word for the male mu, baksu, might have actually been originally borrowed a long time ago in a different form from one of the languages spoken in Central and Northern Eurasia. So all of this leads into the main question I wanted to answer with this episode of Shonen Flop Gaiden. In manga and other pop culture, such as Phantom Seer and Shaman King, that use shamans in their storytelling, how shamanic are these shamans, really? Are there actually shamans in Phantom Seer, Shaman King, and other stories? Well, if we're going by the classical definition of shamanism, then no. Pretty much none of the pop culture stuff we talked about actually involves real shamans. None of these examples from pop culture actually involve the Mongolian and Turkic peoples of Central and Northern Eurasia who actually have shamans as a part of their society. But that aside, if we're willing to broaden the definition of shaman to include individuals who share many of the traits I talked about previously that shamans exhibit, just how shamanesque are these shamans? Can anyone really call these characters shamans with a straight face? Well, in order to answer that question, let's play a game I like to call How Shamanic Are They? That's right, welcome back to the game show where we decide how shamanic are these characters. Today's contestants are the flopped manga series Phantom Seer and the successful manga series of the late 90s and early 2000s, which has recently had a brand new anime adaptation, Shaman King. It's time to play How Shamanic Are They? In this game, we'll be awarding points based on whether or not these series exhibit traits associated with the classic definition of shamanism, other than being from Siberia or Mongolia, of course. Exhibiting a trait clearly will earn that series a point. Somewhat exhibiting that trait will earn half a point. Not exhibiting the trait earns no points. Are you ready to play? Alright, then let's begin. For our first trait we have communicating directly with the transcendent world or the spirit world. And for this category, both Phantom Seer and Shaman King both exhibit this trait. The shamans in both series regularly see, communicate with, and interact with a spirit world which is separate from the physical world that most people don't have a connection to. So both of them get a point. Next, we have special characteristics, such as certain personality characteristics or physical characteristics. Phantom Seer, well, the main character is a big asshole, but that really has nothing to do with him being a shaman, so no points. Shaman King, on the other hand, kinda? The main character exhibits some traits, such as a calm, detached demeanor that he uses to aid in being possessed by spirits. So it's kind of. We'll give him half a point. For the third category, there's assisted by spirits or having a guardian spirit. And yes, both series hinge around a shaman using a special companion spirit to fight and or solve other problems. Both score. Fourth trait, the shaman was chosen by the spirits to become a shaman, even if the shaman themselves really didn't want to do it. And what about Phantom Seer? Well, at first it might seem sort of like this, since the main character of Phantom Seer doesn't like being a shaman and often tries to shirk his duties. However, neither Phantom Seer nor Shaman King scores a point in this round, because in both cases, their shamanic powers or station was hereditary. In classical shamanism, shamanism is not inherited. A shaman is chosen later in life and usually becomes a shaman around the time of adolescence. Trait 5. Shaman stricken with a sickness or otherwise tortured by spirits. Again, 0 on the board. No similarity whatsoever in either of these series. Number 6. A trance state. In Phantom Seer? No, not really. In Shaman King? Yes. The main character is regularly possessed and enters an altered mental state. 7. Shamanic Combat. Both series score a point here. This is Shonen manga we're talking about. Of course there's going to be Shamanic Combat. And of course finally we have the shamanic instruments and paraphernalia. And Phantom Seer, well, kinda has that. The main character has a special shamanic key that he uses in ceremonies and such. So we'll give it half a point. Shaman King, on the other hand, at least from what I've seen of it so far, I'm not an expert in Shaman King or anything, it does not seem like it has anything like that. I might be wrong though. But that's all our categories. So let's tally the points. Phantom Seer, our flop, gets a final score of 3.5 out of 8. And how did its competitor do? Shaman King gets a 4.5 out of 8. I guess that's why they call it the King. And so, the final verdict in today's game of How Shamanic Are They? Shaman King is the winner by exhibiting a little more than half of the traditional traits of a shaman. Thanks for playing, folks. And remember, when trying to score yourself for how shamanic are you, simply feeling like you have a spirit animal or having weird dreams where animal friends talk to you does not count as having a spirit companion. Have a great night. And that's all she wrote for this episode of Shonen Flop Gaiden. How did everyone score on the Shaman test, by the way? My scores are through the roof. I've been studying a lot lately, though. Anyway, I have been your host, Tucker Whatley. And if you want to check out any of the other stuff I've done besides Shonen Flop Gaiden and other assorted work for Shonen Flop, you can check out my personal website / portfolio, www.tuckerwhatley.com. That's www.tuckerwhatley.com. You can also follow me on the Twitters at Tucker Whatley, spelled exactly the same, no punctuation. I hope everyone out there has a magnificent day, night, afternoon, evening, twilight, whatever it is. I love you. Bye. Oh, and see you, Space Cowboy.